What's up guys, Marcus Pixel here, and today I'm gonna be making an addendum to my first video critiquing Legion. As you may imagine, I'm constantly rewatching Legion to make my videos on it, and as I was rewatching the first episode, I noticed there was some stuff I didn't mention that deserved to be included in my critiques, so here I am, to talk about the stuff I left out of that video. Since this is just an addendum, I'll leave the updates for my channel for my next big video, so let's start. In the beginning of the episode, there's a montage of David throughout his life until he tries to kill himself, which has the Who's Happy Jack playing, but I didn't mention exactly what is shown in this montage. The montage starts with the camera pointed at some trees and at the sky, as we transition to baby David in his crib lying down. Then we see him in his crib standing and pointing his hand at something. Then we have toddler David on the floor playing with some toys. One of the toys is a very small version of the devil with yellow eyes, showing that the devil with yellow eyes has been present in David's life since he was a kid. Seeing yellow eyes there is easily missable, but it's a neat detail that shows the attention to making the continuity of the show perfect. In the background we also see a lamp on a desk. That lamp is the same lamp we'll see in Amy's house later in this episode. Something else that is quite interesting is the fact that the lamp has a rocket ship on it and it makes stars appear when it's lit, which is consistent with the fact that David's father was an astronomer, as we saw in chapter 2, and that he used to take David in the middle of the night to see the stars. Then we see David, a bit older, on his bike, and his sister Amy on his right, with some kids skating on the background, all of them in the middle of the street, showing us that David used to live in the country, which is consistent with what we see in David's memories in chapter 2. We then see David holding a trophy after a soccer match, showing that David was a normal kid that lived a normal life, probably trying to make the audience sympathize with him. Then we see him, again a bit older, in a science fair, exploding something and laughing about it, showing that David could be kinda crazy, that he likes destruction. That could have been either David or Yellow Eyes laughing, but it shows that David stopped being a normal kid and he became a pretty bad person. We then see David, a bit older again, screaming, with his hands on his head, with a bunch of people approaching him and yelling at him, which isn't something that actually happened, but shows us quite well what having these voices on his head does to David. We then see late teens David punching someone, most likely at his prom, given his age and how everyone's dressing, showing us once more that David's mental illness turned him into a bad person. Then David, the same age as the last shot we had, since it's the same actor playing him, walks out of a grocery store drinking something, while to his left there's a guy throwing a trash can on fire through the window of the grocery store, and to his right there's a guy pushing another guy with a shopping cart, kinda like David does with Lenny, as we see in chapter 3. As the trash can hits the window, we hear an alarm go off and we start hearing the police get closer. This again shows us that David likes destruction and that he's turned into a bad person as the years went on. We then see David in a cop car, meaning he was about to be arrested, as we hear some voices in David's head yelling at David stuff like, which makes sense because Yellow Eyes wouldn't want David to be arrested and put into a mental hospital. So when David causes that explosion and the windows of the car blow up, it means that Yellow Eyes tried to make David escape the police, but only called more attention to himself and got himself working with a therapist, as we saw in chapter 2, and taking medication. We then see David with a doctor giving him pills, and telling David to take one pill twice a day, as David gets the pill box and rattles it, and we transition to an older David, this one finally played by Dan Stevens, doing the same thing with his medication, sitting on his bed with a naked woman asleep on his bed. A woman that isn't Philly, his girlfriend before Clockworks, as I said in my chapter 2 video. We hear the voices in David's head again being angry at him, which makes sense because Yellow Eyes wouldn't want David to kill himself, since he needs David's body alive, and it's also consistent with what David told his therapist in Clockworks that I mentioned in the first chapter 1 video. Then just before David hangs himself, we see the devil with yellow eyes walking by behind David, showing us again that David is haunted by yellow eyes. A couple minutes later, already in Clockworks, David takes his medication and he's being moved, since he's on a wheelchair, probably because the drugs made him groggy, since David says in season 2 that he doesn't want to go back to being zombie David. As David is being moved to Lenny, we have some intense music playing and we have a few flashes that show the scene in chapter 2 where David and child David cover their eyes. Then we see the world's angriest boy in the world, the boy, not the book. All of that happening while the lights on the day room are being turned on, probably meaning the day is just starting. We then see a guy in the middle of some leaves, probably thinks he's a plant. We see this guy in the Poverello last scene as well. He's dancing in the background, which actually is a nice detail to include in David's dream. The camera shows David's perception of the day room, following his head and eye movement to show the audience what the people at Clockworks are like, showing us that David is in the midst of many people who are categorically insane. After David bumps into Sid, we see him dreaming, and I didn't mention everything we saw in the flashes we see of his dreams, so here we go. David's therapist asks David,
"And how does that make you feel?"
which is repeated right after we see David being nervous at the place where he's having that group therapy session that will happen when this dream sequence ends. We see a quick cut of the drug David took a few seconds earlier when he was in the day room. David answers his therapist's question about how that makes him feel, and he says the drugs help. The fact that the question that Dr. Kissinger is asking David is repeated more than once shows us that David most likely has experienced that question a lot, showing us his monotony in Clockworks, which he already made explicit earlier in the episode, and how every day blends together. We then see the visitation room in Clockworks, where David and his sister Amy met earlier in the episode, and now we see the people that were in that room laughing at David, and we'll know why David is seeing them laugh at him in just a moment. We then see a cut to David in that visitation room again, but now he's alone and looking confused. That means, most likely, that Amy didn't visit David for his birthday on the next year, since we know David stayed at Clockworks for 6 years, and in that earlier scene with Amy, he said it had been 260 weeks since he arrived there, which is basically 5 years. That explains why the people were laughing at him. They weren't actually laughing, but the voices in David's head were laughing at how alone David is, which is consistent with Yellow Eyes' motivations, since he wants David to abandon everyone and everything he cares about, and to make David feel alone so he can make David join him, as we'll see in chapter 6. We then see Sid getting her pills, the same scene we just saw before this one, but now we're seeing it from Sid's perspective, and it shows us that Sid asks the lady with the pills to put them on the counter, which is consistent with Sid not wanting to and not being able to touch people. We see a flash of a ceramic frog, which I mentioned in the original video, and that only becomes important in chapter 2, which I already highlighted in that video as well. Then, just as David bumped into Sid and, in his mind, blew his chances with Sid, the lighting in his room becomes red, and he starts reacting badly to his dreams. We see a quick cut to the kitchen tornado, but now with red lighting. We also see David walking to the Nosy Tide that we saw in the first few minutes of the episode, also with red lighting. We see Kid David asleep, reacting badly to his dreams as well, also with red lighting, showing the audience that David has had these issues since he was a kid. We see Sid walking out of the day room after David bumped into her, just as his therapist asks how David feels, showing us that David blowing his chances with Sid messed with him quite a bit. When David's therapist says,
"The devil with yellow eyes,"
and the writing appears on screen, we see David putting the tape on his mouth with bloody hands, which already shows us a glimpse into what David did to Dr. Poole, as he mentions in a few seconds, and as we see David talk about in chapters 2, 3, and 4. We see Lenny banging some cutlery on a table at Clockworks, pretending she's a drummer, which is a hint that Lenny and Yellow Eyes have become one. The camera goes into a hole near David's bed and we see a small Yellow Eyes there, which could mean that Yellow Eyes isn't at his full strength yet, given his size and the fact that David is taking medication. We see David grabbing his sheets and getting disturbed while he's sleeping, and we see a few quick cuts of the kitchen tornado, with normal lighting this time, as the music gets louder, till David wakes up and his bed falls on the floor, as I said in the original video. Since I want to be very thorough in my critique of Legion, I find it important to point out this clear editing mistake in the episode, where it's clear David's line isn't what he said in that scene, meaning it was probably ADR.
Delusion.
Yes, sure, fine. Then, well, how do you explain what happened to Lenny?
When David was being interrogated, he started to get overwhelmed and was about to use his powers. And I find it important to point out that not only does the interrogator say that he needs David to calm down, which is true because it was his idea not to kill David right away, but the eye gets closer to David, kinda like he does later in the episode when he bangs David's head on the table, showing us that the eye being in this room has the purpose of protecting everyone from David, meaning he's the muscle and the interrogator is the brain. And finally, the people who had brought the brain monitoring equipment into the interrogation room looked scared, which is why David realizes that they were afraid of him. But the only person who wasn't afraid was the interrogator, which is consistent with what I said about him being well trained and remaining calm during potentially dangerous situations. I said that Sid being held by Lenny, which gives David the time to get to her before she leaves, could be argued that it's contrived, but it actually can't, since that's the inciting incident of the show. It's the thing that happens that makes the plot of the show possible, so I was wrong there. I'd also like to correct something I said in my chapter 2 video. I said that Legion's signature credits played for the first time at the end of chapter 2, but that isn't true. The credits play at the end of chapter 1 as well. I just hadn't noticed because the episode ends and we see the Legion logo, then a long pause with a black screen, but the credits do play in chapter 1. I know this video wasn't big or added a lot to what I already said, but I needed to mention the stuff that had been left out so I could guarantee I was thorough, and I also wanted to make a smaller video before moving on to my bigger projects. My next video will probably be Legion chapter 3, and I'll talk about some updates for my channel then. So yeah guys, if you enjoyed, please leave a like, subscribe if you're new to the channel, check out the Legion playlist, it's in the description in the top right corner. Yeah, till next time guys, bye bye.